Well, welcome to Freak Month on Blue Collar Reformation. PBR here, your host today. And we begin today with one of the things that has been shown to be what it really is in the life of the church these days, especially within the Reformed churches, and that is the rise of evangelical feminism in the Reformed and Presbyterian churches. And now I'm not talking about the mainline denominations. It's been there for quite a long time. There's the ordination of women in the Presbyterian Church in the United States and other denominations, mainline denominations throughout the land. But at the same time, like this hasn't been really seen in evangelicalism. Evangelicalism in general has been moving to the left theologically for quite a while, kind of aping the world, taking on different forms of like just, musical styles from the world, which is not the worst thing in the world, but also like business methods from the world and other things that we see coming up. But one of the things that started to really happen in the last 20 years is that the Reformed churches have moved to the left theologically with practical things where it really hasn't in the past, at least in the conservative circles. Now, you can point out in history, the first woman to be ordained was actually in the 1800s in a Presbyterian church, but that was a little bit of a microcosm of an ideology that was just beginning at the time. And what's happened in the last 20 or so years is that more people who have been educated in a modernist education system coming into Reformed theology have imbibed deeply of these Hegelian and dialectical materialistic worldviews that feminism really fits in. So explain that. I have to say that basically it's materialistic. That means that the world is what it is. Now, these are Christians who are materialistic, but they believe in what's called a process theology, where you have a thesis of its current status quo that's going on. There's like this consensus thesis of society. And that what ends up happening is that there is an antithesis to that thesis that comes up. There's some group or some ideology that's moving progress forward to a purer state that the world will eventually be in. And then eventually you get a synthesis of the two, where the two ideas are basically brought together. And a lot of times this happens accidentally. People don't realize that they're caught in this progress theology because they've grown up with it in their homes, in their families, in their education system, in everything they've seen on television, everything they've seen in the movies. All media is basically in this process theology kind of way of thinking. And what we're seeing today is that even within the church, there's this sort of way of aping the world and copying the world in terms of like, what are the things that they're interested in? What are the things that they want to talk about? And one of those hot button issues is the subject of feminism and the roles of males and females within the church. And so there's a lot of talk about that, a lot of books that have been written. And one that's particularly that made a entrance into the Reformed community was Amy Bird's book, No Little Women. Now, when we first read this, it was coming off of her writing from some fairly solid books in the past. She was on a podcast with Carl Trueman, who is no mean biblical scholar and historian himself, although kind of an odd duck, but he's a brilliant scholar and been writing some very helpful things in the last few years. But what we've seen is that since she dropped off of that podcast, that she has written this book and several others since called No Little Women. And what's ended up happening is that this was really her coming out book as really imbibing in a lot of the ideology of feminism, even though she rejects it. She rejects the label of feminism in the book. Still, a lot of the thinking is definitely coming from that direction. So when we're looking at this, we don't call her a feminist in this book because it wasn't full-blown feminism or evangelical feminism, but sort of the foundation of where it's coming from started here. We read this for our women's book club at church, and I picked it up and I was like, we should read this book. This book, she's a pretty solid author. She wrote a book called Housewife Theologian. I had heard her on Wages of Spin with Carl Trueman and the other guy who I can't remember at the moment. And it was, always pretty solid things, although a little goofy on their podcast. It was pretty lightweight subject matter that they took on. But, it was reputation. So we picked up the book. We got a bunch of copies of it. Everybody starts reading it. And then a few chapters in, we're like, what in the world is this? And I'll show you what I mean. So really what it ends up doing, here's basically the net effect of it, is it makes men and women partners in marriage and in the church, rather than having the order of creation. So as a call for basically equality of the sexes instead of an order of creation between the two, depending on the vocations that you're in. Now, things are much more complicated than this because actually, within society, we have hierarchies. Within the church, we have hierarchy. Within the family, there's hierarchy, but she makes everything sort of flat. And I'll show you where it is. Starting on page 24 of the book, which is No Little Women, you can see it here. Page 24, it begins a study of the word helpmeet in Genesis chapter 2. So Eve is called the helpmeet of Adam. And she's particularly taking on the word helper with the citation of a lecture given by a guy named John McKinley in this chapter, in this section, and that becomes pervasive throughout the rest of the book. So what she ends up saying is that the word helper can often bring up connotations of inferiority in our culture. Think of mommy's little helper in the kitchen. Isn't it cute that she wants to help mommy? Let's give her a bowl with some ingredients to stir and help her fetch a few things from the fridge, that sort of thing. So definitely like inferiority, helper, and things like that. She's saying it comes up with our connotation generally of an inferior, like a helper. And then she points out that when it talks about God, that God is a helper too, but he's a helper in the sense of a source of our strength. But then what she ends up doing is she, quoting McKinley, argues that the female, the woman, in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 was a helper in the sense of a source of strength rather than a helper in the sense of a helpmeet, which is an inferior role, but is one where it is good. It is ordained by God, where there's an order of authority and submission, which you see in the New Testament so clearly laid out with the word submission. And so there's a distinction that has to be made. And you can even see it betrayed within the quotations that she has. So she goes on and talks about the word azar, and she'll translate it strength, which no doubt it's translated that way. For example, Psalm 89:17 is particularly interesting, and she quotes it, "For you are the glory of their strength." So that's the word azar there. "By your favor, our horn is exalted." Here we have our word azar, usually translated helper, translated instead as strength. And so the argument ends up being that God is the rescuer, God is the superior, God is the source of strength for the battle. And therefore, this concept applies to Eve. Now, this is a word concept fallacy. And here's the presuppositional mistake that's happening here is the connotation of helper as an inferior who is helping versus a superior that is saving, or a peer that is helping in the sense of maybe saving or giving aid or something like that. Those are the contexts where this word can appear, and it means different things in different contexts. She takes the context of God and she applies it to the wife in the context of marriage in the Garden of Eden. And that's a problem, because here's the quote from John McKinley. Now, there's not a book on this or a paper. It's a audio file that she's quoting, and it reads like this. "The issue is azar is neither equality nor subordination." So that's his first thing he says. Azar is neither equality nor subordination, but distinction and relatedness. Now, the first thing I got to point out there is what distinction and what relation. Uh, it's either a relation of helper that's inferior or superior. So you end up with this problem of he says this and he says it's not this, and it's like some sleight of hand where he's not saying the same thing. So he goes on to say, "She is to be for the man as an ally to benefit him in the work they were given to do, just as Azar tells of God's relatedness to Israel as the necessary support for survival and military perils." So when it says "just as," it's basically saying that God is brought down to our partner, that God is with us, but he's like our partner. And that's clearly not the case in the scripture. So this word, you see it in the word like Ebenezer. Ebenezer means a rock of our help. God is our rock of our help. And she takes this and applies it to the male and female relationship and flattens them out. Now, I'm going to get into some of the implications of this in a future video, but I just want to point out here, this is a word concept fallacy. She's taking the word, adding a concept that's foreign to the context, and placing it upon this. and resulting in a flattening and a partnership between the two. Now, this is plain to see, even if you don't read Hebrew and Greek to see these words. It's plain on the face of it that this is a different context, and words mean things in their context. So this is our first installment on Freak Month, and I hope you enjoy it. This is PBR signing off. Thank you for watching Blue Collar Reformation. We are here to equip you with wisdom of the Word. The aim is to apply the system of doctrine taught in Scripture to every square inch of faith and life. We are on Twitter and Substack for your sake. Links are in the description. Share with your recalcitrant and reprobate friends and family freely. Blue Collar Reformation is a lightweight and mobile outreach platform. Take it in hand and enter the fray. Godspeed.